Hey everyone, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks whether we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy who ate too many of those sour, toxic waste candies as a kid. I'm probably going to get a ton of cancers. Balloon Schlee. In today's episode, the liberal case for localism, or why I think devolving authority to local governments represents a more effective way to achieve contemporary liberal political objectives than acting through the current system. This is going to be a very vibes-based, qualitative episode, so if you're expecting me to have case cites or papers or statistics or treatises like I sometimes do in other episodes, you're going to be a bit disappointed. But we're sort of in an era of vibes-based politics, so just let me talk my shit for a little bit, and who knows, maybe I'll say something that you find persuasive. Brief thing before we get started. Full disclosure, I am a liberal with my politics, so you can assume that I probably agree to a lot of what I'm going to present as reasons that liberals should consider localism as a viable means to achieve their political goals. But I'm also going to go beyond personal belief and present reasons that may not resonate with me, but that I think do resonate with liberals who might have values or preferences that are different from mine. This isn't a list of why I think we should do localism. This is a list of here's why you, hypothetical gestalt of your average left-leaning person, might want to do localism. With that caveat, let's get into it. If I was being oversimplistic, and let's be honest, I love a good oversimplification, I'd sum up the liberal case for localism in 2 words: Donald Trump. Here's someone who, if you're a liberal, you view as being an active threat to everything you stand for: diversity, equity, racial justice, immigrant rights, healthcare, sensible regulation, international charity, support for our allies abroad, the end of military aid to countries that lack respect for human rights, organized labor, disentanglement of corporate interests from politics, gun reform, environmental protections, and a program of taxation that forces billionaires to pay their fair share. Trump is seeking to work against all of these social goals, and the federal government is his instrument for achieving that regression. And his allies in state legislatures across the country, state legislatures that, on average, lean conservative because of an overrepresented minority of rural voters, are lining up for their marching orders. Make local government the highest government in the land, and suddenly the Trumps and Greg Abbotts and Ron DeSantis of the world aren't the ones on top anymore. Localism achieves exactly that, by making your local government be the one that calls the shots, with Trump and his cronies having no ability to dictate how you want things to be run in your community. If you're a liberal, what other reason do you need? Okay, so let's get a little more specific than just Trump bad. Let's instead carefully consider what it is about Trump that liberals dislike, and why localism could help avoid or ameliorate that particular problem that he specifically presents. So what makes Trump unique is not that he is a president with a conservative administration that seeks to accomplish conservative policies. We've had plenty of those in the country's history. I still think it's safe to say that most liberals dislike Trump more and view him as a more significant threat to their interests than, say, a George H.W. Bush. So what is it about Trump that makes him unique? Well, I think the answer is that Trump is rapidly expanding the authority of the executive and using that expanded authority to make drastic changes in a host of fields. He's moving fast and breaking things, and not too concerned about whether the law is in his favor. He's invoking war powers and refusing to spend money that Congress set aside, and firing the heads of statutorily independent agencies. He's flirting with saying that the executive branch can disregard judicial orders, and with the idea of running for a 3rd term, though that latter bit may just be him trying to rile people up, something he loves to do. The scary thing about Trump for a liberal isn't necessarily what he wants to do, it's how he wants to do it. The unprecedented way that he's willing to defy political norms, the law, and institutional inertia to achieve his conservative objectives. Now here's the thing. Trump certainly has a unique personality and a unique outlook, to say the least, on the role of the executive. But as long as the current federal system stays in place, the system that puts one dude at the top of the country with all the levers of power at his disposal, there is always the risk of someone like Trump arising. And because the authority of the federal government is so widespread and so total, when someone like Trump enters the scene, every corner of the country will inevitably feel his presence. The only way to safeguard against an executive that says full speed ahead and ignore any icebergs is to make it so the executive isn't the captain of your ship. Someone like Trump is only dangerous because of the political system that supports him and provides him power. The system that means a bunch of people living totally across the country from you can decide they like an old, bitter, vengeful, callous billionaire, and suddenly that guy's in charge, and everybody suffers for it, not just the people who supported him. That's why localism presents a better alternative for liberals. No more billionaires being elevated to a high office with near absolute power. No more having your votes count less just because of where you live. No more needing to contend with the opinions of conservatives who live outside your community and don't understand its problems. A society where local governments call all the shots is a society where a Trump-like figure arises, but his ill effects do not spread across the entire country. They're instead contained within solely those communities that support his presidency, and those that do not are free to disregard him at will. And here's a little secret while we're in the neighborhood. Given the general stink that Democratic politicians have raised about Trump's expansion of executive authority, you might suspect that once the pendulum has swung the other way, and it always does swing the other way, that the next Democratic president will renounce these excesses and stay within her bounds. But I can virtually guarantee you that will not be the case. Instead, the next Democratic president will put a veneer of institutional responsibility over her actions, and then will fully exploit the new levers of power Trump's actions are currently creating. She'll take advantage of all the expanded authority to do things that you agree with, whether that be alter immigration policy, or change federal policy on transgender individuals, or crack down on racism. And for a while, it'll be great. In fact, if she doesn't use her expanded authority to try and achieve liberal policy objectives, you'll see a lot of Democrats calling for her head. She won't really have much of a choice but to accept new additions to her levers of power and then use those new levers to achieve the things that her supporters want her to achieve. But in using all the new, unprecedented power that Trump is now creating for the executive, the next Democratic president will do something important. She'll turn those unprecedented powers into precedented ones. And then when the next Trump comes around and ends up in office, the expectations will have shifted. He'll be able to go even further than Trump did. And this cycle will just keep repeating itself over and over again until one of two things happen. Either A, the window keeps moving until finally it moves too far, and the country elects someone who simply destroys the entire national order. Or B, we embrace localism, rejecting the idea of a top-heavy executive outright. If local governments have full authority, then that of course includes the authority to ignore and override any directives that may come out of the White House. The president can expand his authority all he pleases. Its effects will be extremely limited, as it will be unable to touch communities unless those communities consent to being so bound. Imagine if, instead of the way things are now, where you wake up in the morning and read the headlines with dread to see what crazy shit Trump has done now, and you're forced to live with whatever you discover, you could see the latest nutty pronouncement and go, "No way, man, not in my community," and then just vote to override the law at the next town council meeting. Doesn't that sound empowering? Doesn't that sound like a political system where the most vulnerable and discriminated against people in your community are more likely to be protected? But okay, let's put aside Trump for a moment. An optimistic liberal might view Trump as just sort of an oddity, an aberration, and that normalcy will eventually restore itself. Here's the thing. That normalcy is still less conducive to achieving your liberal objectives than a localist alternative would be. Conservatives are often fond of saying that most square miles of America are red, not blue. And you know what? They're right. They're 100% right. Look at any political map of America and you'll see that's the truth. That doesn't mean that most people in America are necessarily Republicans, but it certainly means that most places in America are Republican. And the way our current system works, it's largely places that vote, not people. Why is this the case? Why do I say this? Two reasons. First is the Electoral College. In essence, the practical effect of the Electoral College is to give small states with low populations, and such states are overwhelmingly conservative, a disproportionately large say in electing the president. That's how you end up with North Dakota having 3 electoral votes and a population of less than 1 million, while places like California have 54 electoral votes with a population of 39 million. That may not seem so bad. California, which is very liberal, has a lot more electoral votes than North Dakota, so doesn't it mean that the liberals are actually overrepresented? But then you realize that this means that the Electoral College gives North Dakota around 1 electoral vote for every 300,000 residents, and it only gives California about 1 electoral vote for about every 700,000 state residents. More straightforwardly, the Electoral College treats a citizen in North Dakota as being 2 to 3 times more important than a citizen who lives in California when it comes to deciding who the president of the whole country should be. Why? Simple. It's just because of where they live. This is literally land voting rather than people. Same thing with how the Senate works, which, to be clear, is partially why the Electoral College works the way that it does. Your amount of Electoral College votes are bound up in the amount of senators and state representatives you have in Congress. But in addition to how the stuff works with the Electoral College, the Senate functions in such a way that every state gets 2 senators, no matter how big it is. North Dakota gets 2, and California gets 2. Look at a presidential election map of the country, and you'll see that the Republicans are right. Most places are red. America is basically a handful of urbanized, high-population, left-leaning states floating in a sea of smaller conservative states. And the Senate cares only about land, about state borders, about how big that ocean of red is, even if there's almost nobody living in it. If America was made up of 5 states with 1 trillion citizens each and 45 states with 1 million people living in them total, then the Senate would still have 90 conservatives and 10 liberals in it, probably. Why? Because the Senate isn't about people voting. It's about land voting. And as long as land is what matters in the federal system rather than people, then conservatives will always have disproportionate political power, as they are entirely correct that most places in America lean right. And guess what? This problem just reproduces itself in miniature at the state level. The average square mile of even liberal bastions like New York and California still tends to be conservative. If you're a liberal and you look at the political map of your state, chances are you're going to see a few densely populated blue urban islands floating in a sea of red, more rural counties. Those counties will elect conservative politicians who will constantly try to disrupt your attempts to pass liberal policy at the state level. Localism offers liberals a way out of this nasty situation without really sacrificing the interests of conservatives. Rather than have to try to navigate a federal system that's stacked in favor of small conservative states, or a statewide system that pits you against neighboring counties, why not just make it that every local government has the authority to engage in self-rule? Then you can pass the good laws and achieve the good policy yourself, and your decisions won't bind anyone in any of these smaller rural counties that currently you are forced to fight against. You don't need to fight against some tiny conservative state 1,000 miles away or a conservative county that's on the opposite side of your state under a localist model. Your community just decides for itself and only for itself what it wants, and so do all the other communities, with nobody playing spoiler. Localism would also benefit residents of liberal areas within otherwise conservative states. Anyone who's ever lived in, for example, a Democratic city swallowed up inside a Republican state can tell you it's tough sledding. You get blamed for every social ill. Crime is your fault. Drugs are your fault. Bad schools are your fault. High prices are your fault. Problems with the state budget are your fault. And the conservative state politicians love nothing more than to play to their base by just flat out abusing you with targeted policy. Even if conservatives in the state legislature don't actively turn you into the next front in the culture war, they still block every attempt you make to try and solve the unique problems your city faces and the state politicians' rural conservative supporters may not share with you. Localism would let you finally start taking all the common sense actions that your community needs to do in order to address its unique problems. Localism would protect you from conservative communities and politicians who otherwise will take every opportunity to interfere in your community and prevent you from exercising political agency. Localism also promises a way to achieve important political objectives now, immediately, like right away, instead of having to watch massive federal and state political machinery slowly grind towards something hopefully resembling a positive outcome. I cannot emphasize enough how slow and ineffectual the federal government is in passing liberal policy. Part of that is just the fact that the federal Congress is a huge, unwieldy body that is constantly having to fight every fire that may arise across the entire country, something that even an efficient and well-functioning body would struggle with, never mind Congress. Part of this is by design. Slow roll stuff you verbally support but secretly want killed, or that your corporate backers secretly want killed, thereby satisfying your constituents on the surface while really ensuring that the law never sees the light of day. Part of this is the political reality that you're going to have to horse trade and jump through all the hoops and fend off the attempts of conservative politicians to disrupt your agenda, sure. No matter the exact cause, the end result is that Congress just doesn't get shit done very quickly, and that slowness leads to lost opportunities. Seriously. Assume that Congress and the presidency were both controlled by Democrats who were genuinely committed to achieving some specific liberal objective, let's say universal health care. Even if everyone in the party worked in good faith to try and get the laws passed to make that happen, how long do you think that would take? A year? 2? 5? Compare that to localism, where the process, while certainly not free of its warts and bumps, is simple. Get everyone together on a given date and have an up and down vote. No need for horse trading. No need to try and figure out whether two houses of the legislature are on the same page. No need to try and figure out whether or not one rogue politician, either on the far left or in the center, is going to throw everything into chaos. Just you and your community making the changes you want to see and expressing your political preferences via directly democratic procedures. While we're on the topic of national political maneuverings, if you're a smelly lefty like myself, how are you feeling about the National Democratic Party these days? Happy with how they weakened at Bernie's Joe Biden and desperately tried to hide the fact that his brains were melting out of his ear? Think that they really showed how in touch they were with the common voter by trotting out Hollywood billionaire after Hollywood billionaire during the 2024 campaign? And speaking of that campaign, what's your feeling on the fact that you were given a presidential candidate that you didn't choose through a primary process? And now that the Dems have fumbled 2024, you think Chuck Schumer and the other institutional Dems are being effective in keeping Trump from implementing his agenda? Well, I don't know about you all, but I am less than enthused by how things have been handled. Now, maybe it's possible that a great upsurge of voter discontent and public participation is going to reform the Democratic Party and make it a more accountable, grounded, and unified party with leaders you feel represent your interests and that you're excited to support. But I'm pretty sure we all know that this is unlikely to happen, and that the gerontocracy and party insiders will continue to run things in 2026, 2028, and beyond. Localism's inversion of the pyramid of preemption and embrace of direct democracy is exactly the shock to the system that is needed to get the Democratic Party back on track, or even to allow other parties to emerge that do a better job of being responsive to your interests. What's more grassroots than giving voters on the ground, the people living in our towns and counties and cities across America, the direct ability to govern for themselves? No more need to try and find some palatable way of pitching things that unites centrists and radicals alike. No more need to lean on all the old party kingmakers who provide the treasure and network needed to win in national scale elections. Just Democratic voters calling the shots in their own backyards. And if you're a liberal who is uncomfortable with the Democratic Party, but has always viewed withholding your support as essentially a vote for the Republican Party, well, localism creates the conditions needed for new parties to arise and act as something other than spoilers. The problem with the federal government having preemptory power and federal candidates being elected nation or statewide is that even if some communities generally want different options, they kind of get swept up in the national current. If you're in Burlington, Vermont, but you know that when you vote for federal decision makers, you have to take into account what voters in North Carolina are going to think, maybe you decide you have no choice but to jump on board with a consensus candidate that you otherwise wouldn't support. Well, in a localist system, the federal government is no longer at the top, so federal elections don't matter as much. The consequences for voting third party are less severe. And because your local government has full self-governing authority, if there's a genuine coalition in your community that wants to be something other than part of the Democratic Party, then you'll be able to not only join that coalition without worrying that your support is just a drop in the national or statewide bucket, but you also see that coalition immediately exercise political agency by having their members cast votes in the directly democratic local legislature. And, of course, governance directly by the people themselves rather than by elected representatives means that all the gamesmanship and zero-sum realities of elections disappears, and people will be able to accurately express their genuine preferences via the directly democratic system. Now let's talk about another huge problem for liberals, the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary in general. Let's play a fun if somewhat morbid game called Who is going to be the next Supreme Court justice to die? Well, if we go purely off of age, then the answer is that probably Thomas will be the next to die, followed by Alito, then Sotomayor, and Roberts may be croaking around the same time. I say die because I have exactly no faith that a conservative justice will step down at a time where a liberal admin would be able to appoint a liberal judge to replace him. Now, in a world, like ours, where there's a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, this means pretty much some version of the following events would need to occur in this exact order for liberals to have any chance of controlling the Supreme Court in the next 10 to 20 or even 30 years. First, Thomas dies while there's a liberal president. He dies at a time where the Senate is controlled by liberals as well, which by my count has only been true during 21 terms in the 20th and 21st century, and those numbers are inflated by Woodrow Wilson and FDR, who account for just 10 of those terms just between the two of them. To be clear, these number of terms I'm referring to are times when the presidency and the Senate was both controlled by Democrats. The Senate would then need to have the time to actually bring the president's chosen replacement up for an appointment vote. You better hope that the margin in the Senate isn't too close, or otherwise you might run the risk of a few centrist Dems peeling off and declining to support the nominee. And if all of these stars align, all of this stuff works out, and you do manage to miraculously get a good candidate appointed to the court, then the end result will be a Supreme Court that is still 5-4 in favor of conservatives. So then you need to pray that the stars align for a second time. Lightning strikes twice. Alito dies around the same time or at another time when the Democrats manage to control the presidency and the Senate. And this happens across the entire time between when Thomas and Alito die, so that there's no conservative administration where Thomas and Alito could step down and be replaced by someone young. And oh yeah, by the way, if at any point Sotomayor or Kagan girl boss a little too close to the sun, like RBG did, and refused to step down despite being obviously near to incapacitation or death, then this whole process gets reset. Those two lightning strikes no longer mean shit unless you somehow get a third or fourth lightning strike. And this process is just playing out in miniature in federal circuit courts across the country, because conservatives have mounted an extremely successful campaign over the past decades of making conservative judicial appointments to federal courts a priority. Basically, if you're a liberal, you're staring down the barrel of 20 years of conservative judicial rule. And because federal law is basically just whatever the fuck the federal judiciary says it is, that means unless something drastically changes about the American system of government, you're looking at 20 plus years where unelected, unaccountable, completely unchecked conservative officials get to decide what the law is and what your rights are. Fun. But localism would get rid of this problem almost entirely. I say almost because, to be clear, every single version of localism, absolute or otherwise, maintains the preemptive power of constitutional rights. Any rights derived from the federal or state constitution will remain the supreme law of the land, and local governments, who otherwise occupy the top of the preemption pyramid, will have no authority to limit them. And since the Supreme Court is in charge of interpreting those rights, well, they'll still have that power. Though, of course, if the Supreme Court wakes up one day and is like, I don't think this right should exist anymore, you and your community in a localist system could simply go and vote and pass a law that says, well, the people who live in this community do have this right. So there are ways to deal with even this pretty big asterisk. That aside, the Supreme Court just interprets federal law. If federal law, aside from the Constitution, becomes subordinate to local law, then who cares if the Supreme Court does some dumb shit? It's your locality's laws that matter, and the court doesn't have the authority to roll in and say whatever they want about those laws. They can put 9 old conservative dudes up on the bench for all you care. They still won't be able to call the shots on what happens in your community or invent reasons to strike down your local laws because they don't like them. If you're following a default federal law and the Supreme Court reinterprets that law in a way you don't like, you can just pass a new law at the local level and the problem is solved. Make local government capable of self-rule is a hell of a lot more of an achievable practical solution to dealing with the Supreme Court than hope and pray and wish that people die at the right time and the political process works and none of our people die and we control the Senate and the presidency forever and ever. Now let's talk about executive agencies. Democrats generally are a fan of federal regulatory entities, seeing them as a way to make sure someone is keeping a vigilant eye on corporate or other actors that might otherwise abuse the public. The EPA protects the environment, the Department of Labor keeps a firm leash on companies to make sure that people don't get screwed out of their overtime pay, the CFPB monitors banks to prevent another 2008, etc., etc. State agencies play a similar role in those areas that federal agencies haven't occupied. If we pursue a localist system of government, aren't we giving up the benefits of these benevolent sentinels of the public good? So for the purposes of this point, I'm going to assume that federal agencies under liberal administrations are generally staffed with people who care about ensuring that they are accountable to the public at large, take their responsibilities as public servants seriously, and are motivated to keeping the gears of government turning as efficiently as possible. I'm going to be honest, I've worked in a federal agency during liberal administrations, and that was not at all my experience. I don't want to hide the ball on my biases here. But let's assume for the sake of argument that I'm just bitter, and in fact, when your fellow liberals are in charge, they turn agencies into beneficial organizations. Here's the problem. We've seen how when control shifts and when the conservative forces you oppose take over those agencies, they instantly transform into something that is the complete opposite of beneficial, and indeed become these vehicles to achieve exactly the opposite policies that you want. Right now, from the liberal point of view, the EPA isn't protecting the environment. It's just a vehicle for guiding corporate use of federal land and reducing regulatory expenses. The DOJ is less about protecting civil rights and ensuring public accountability than it is an organization dedicated to attacking Trump's political enemies. The CFPB is an instrument of banking interests and financial hucksters who want to find new abusive ways to make a buck. And not to put too fine a point on it or be too cute, but DOJ is, at least on paper, a federal agency. It used to be called the United States Digital Service, which was itself a department within an agency called the Executive Office of the President. Guess who launched the United States Digital Service? Obama. And guess when the executive office of the president was created? Its originating statute was the Reorganization Act of 1939, which was passed after FDR, who you might call the father of the current administrative state, lobbied Congress to create the executive office. DOGE is a premium example of the fact that well-intentioned agencies just become damaging instruments of conservative power every time the admin changes over. And so you end up with this kind of catch-22. You could imbue agencies with broad powers to achieve their regulatory or judicial purposes, but that means that those broad powers will be accessible to conservative interests unless you maintain control of the federal government at all times, which of course you won't. You could instead make agencies limited and give them very little power. But then they're just these ineffectual examples of bureaucratic bloat that don't actually accomplish that much. So why keep them around at all? Localism provides a way out of this catch-22. If local governments have full authority of self-rule, then if you and your community like the way that the Fed's agencies are regulating and officiating, then you can always opt to defer to those bodies. Their expertise and institutional knowledge will remain available to you. And if you instead aren't pleased with the way the agencies are protecting the public interest, well, then you can just pass a law locally that says we're disregarding X guidance from the agency, or we hereby preempt X agency regulation. Federal agencies would cease to be these legislating bodies that provide controlling top-down laws and instead become these extremely useful, low-stakes advisory bodies that can safely change hands between administrations without placing serious fields like workplace safety and financial regulation at risk. Okay, so that was like a lot of broad stroke system level stuff. Let's briefly do a lightning round of specific liberal policies and see how localism could help achieve them and how federal action has failed it. Abortion. If you're a liberal, it's fucking crazy that the Democrats have had control of the House and the Senate and the presidency twice since 2000 and still didn't manage to codify Roe v. Wade. Clearly, there is something about the federal top-down political system that makes getting this task done impossible. Luckily, in localism, all you need to do to codify Roe v. Wade in your own community is a simple majority vote. And the federal or state government couldn't come in to override your own judgment about what's best for women and families in your community. You wouldn't have to navigate around conservative rural counties in your state or the deep red South at the federal level. It's Roe right now in your own backyard instead of Roe maybe in the future when the political winds turn our way again and we're not worried that bringing up abortion will hurt our re-election chances. Foreign policy. From the liberal perspective, the last 30 and arguably the last 70 years of American foreign policy have mostly involved A, propping up horrible dictators in Southern America and elsewhere, and B, bombing the shit out of people overseas, which to absolutely nobody's surprise has entirely failed to bring stability or safety to those regions. All this death, and for what? A couple of oil execs get some more billions? Harris gets to tout us as having the most lethal army in the world during campaign stops? In a localist America, you could pass local laws declaring that you won't abide a congressional declaration of war, or will withhold taxes unless defense spending decreases, or certain foreign agencies, or will refuse to draft individuals into the military, or will refuse to buy products from a foreign government whose values don't align with your own. And more generally, a localist America where power has been devolved to local governments will simply lack the necessary consolidated power at the federal level to engage in the kind of military adventurism and CIA fuck-aroundism that has become the norm. Taxes. Oh boy, a lot to unpack with this one. Okay, so first of all, giving local governments broader taxing authority means that liberal communities can finally decide for themselves how to structure an equitable tax system. Want to pass a special billionaire tax? Go ahead and do it. And the DC lobbyists don't have the power to stop you. This is especially attractive because the richest places in America are usually liberal, so being able to impose local income or other taxes is especially important in those areas. Will rich people just pick up and move elsewhere? Maybe. One outcome of localism could be a really gross race to the bottom, where local governments trip over each other to try and provide more business-friendly environments to corporations and rich people. But guess what? That happens anyway under the current system. At least localism gives you and your community the power to weigh that factor and make your own decision about how to proceed, instead of just taking the ability to decide out of your hands and putting it in the hands of elected officials who often are beholden to the same interests that view politics as a cheaper investment than paying their fair share of taxes. Additionally, since liberal localities and states tend to be richer than conservative ones, it wouldn't be unfair to describe blue areas as subsidizing red ones via federal taxes. In a localist system, your community could vote to override federal tax laws and refuse to pay taxes to the federal government, thereby ensuring that your dollars stay local rather than flowing to subsidized citizens of states who constantly deride you, take actions contrary to your values, and treat you as enemies. Lots to think about here. I think I'm going to do an episode in the future on how exactly federal taxes would work in a localist America, so stay tuned. DEI. Conservatives are clearly using DEI as a cover to just make sure that all the power and money continues to flow to white dudes, same as it always has. So long as the president can wake up one morning and decide to have the EEOC investigate groups that do things like have affinity groups or admit that America was bad to black people for most of its history, and the federal Congress can decide fuck these states in particular and pass laws about punishing diversity, then efforts to make society a fairer place will always be in danger. A localist system, the power to decide how your government will right past wrongs and level the playing field will be in you and your neighbors' hands, not some old white senator with a southern drawl who in his private moments thinks fondly of his childhood when Jim Crow was still around. Immigration. Cities can declare themselves as sanctuary cities all they want, but at the end of the day, the federal government is still the one that sets nationwide immigration policy, and still the one who can send ICE agents to yank people out of their homes in the middle of the night for dubious or no reason. Want to make your community a true sanctuary? Undergo localist reforms and put the full power to decide immigration policy in your own hands. You can make your community a place to fully welcome and empower immigrants, and a place that is a bulwark against whatever nativism conservatives are ineffectually spewing at the federal level. Plus, not for nothing, but right now you're footing the bill for all these border security measures happening at border states that probably are not where you live and that you probably don't support. Shit, if those guys want closed borders so much, they can pay for that themselves, rather than reaching into your pocket and using your money to take actions that you believe are wrong. Healthcare. Kind of similar to the abortion discussion. How is it that Democrats have controlled the entire government multiple times in our lifetime and still haven't made single-payer healthcare happen? The best we got was Obamacare, which was a good thing in as much as it was better than what we had before, but was still a far cry from a system in which healthcare was a public utility rather than a private good gated by income and job status. The need to navigate around conservative states and counties, the gamesmanship of political parties, the massive complexity of trying to implement a nationwide or statewide program of single-payer healthcare have all made achieving universal healthcare a near impossibility at the federal level. So too have the preemptory effects of laws like ERISA that keep states from telling employers to redirect their health plan spending away from federal programs and towards local single-payer systems. And, of course, state and local governments' limited taxing authority also plays a factor. Localism makes it possible to achieve single-payer healthcare within your community without having to deal with federal-level politics or elected candidates propped up by the pharmaceutical or insurance lobbies. It would be challenging, no question of that. You need to find a way to make the math pencil out, and you wouldn't be able to negotiate over prices as strongly as the federal government could, as the amount of people you're negotiating on behalf of would be smaller than the whole country's population. But at least the decision would be yours, and your community would have the authority both to decide whether single-payer healthcare is a good idea and how best to accomplish that objective. Housing. Despite having a whole-ass Department of Housing and Urban Development, the federal government just doesn't build very much housing itself. Instead, it mostly hands over money to private developers and provides certain tax incentives to try and get affordable rental housing constructed. It does administer the very important Section 8 program, but that program does not itself make housing more affordable. It just provides a subsidy that puts a Band-Aid on the problem, and also conveniently helps public funds flow into the pockets of private landlords. Meanwhile, state governments are busy handcuffing local governments' authority to handle how housing works, either by outright banning things like rent control or affordability requirements for new development or ADUs, or by limiting the ability of localities to make their own zoning decisions. Localism would immediately let your community change zoning to encourage both an increase in housing supply broadly and a system of development where developers must make meaningful contributions to affordable housing in order to access market rate development. At a time where rents and evictions are huge problems that weigh particularly heavy on liberal communities, fast-moving changes at the local level are exactly what's required to stem the flow of housing burdens. The environment. It doesn't look like Trump EPA is going to exactly be a champion of responsible environmental stewardship, huh? Quite the opposite. Under the current system, the EPA could actually issue regulations that lower the standard for things like pollution requirements, then say that these lowered standards preempt state or local standards that are more demanding. And of course, conservative politicians in Congress love to pass laws that preempt state and local efforts to address environmental issues. Under localism, the ability to regulate emissions and waste and energy production would be directly in your hands, and execs from BP or big tech wouldn't be able to buy off federal politicians to get in your way. You can make it clear that anyone who lives or does business in your community must meet a standard of minimum respect for the earth or find another place to be. Gun control. So again, localism doesn't change anything about constitutional rights, and that means the Second Amendment is staying right where it is. There are plenty of common sense forms of gun control that would be completely consistent with the Constitution, but that federal or state governments still refuse to pass. Things like keeping guns out of the hands of domestic abusers, banning the carrying of guns in certain sensitive places, safety and storage requirements, permitting requirements for concealed carry, liability for gun manufacturers whose guns end up with criminals, gun show loopholes, strict ID and background checks, banning ghost guns, banning bump stocks, requiring ammunition to be purchased in person rather than online. In a localist system, you could pass all of these requirements yourselves, and know that the gun lobby won't be able to lean on state or federal politicians to come and interfere with your efforts to make your community safer. Organized labor. The Federal National Labor Relations Act, which sets out the laws for how organized labor in the private sector works, is one of the most ineffectual statutes imaginable. It doesn't even let the government penalize companies or unions who break the law, and it makes pretty benign stuff like secondary boycotts. That's boycotting someone because they do business with the main target that you're trying to boycott, kind of like if you boycotted a bakery because it sold products to Starbucks that you were encouraging people to boycott. Illegal. Yeah, you can't do that. That's considered an unfair labor practice. The Railway Labor Act and Fair Labor Standards Act aren't much better. Local government could provide much more robust protections for organized labor. If not for the fact that all these federal laws occupy the field, meaning that they would preempt state-level attempts to level the playing field between workers and companies. Things like the PRO Act have no chance of seeing the light of day as long as they must run the gauntlet of nationwide politics, allowing conservative politicians and multinational corporations to interfere. In a localist America, you and your other community members would be free to create a labor environment where employees can choose whether or not to unionize, and attempts by anti-union consultants or bad faith employers to unlawfully kill nascent labor movements will be meaningfully punished. And on that note, that's the liberal case for localism. There's other stuff I could have talked about, of course, but I think this is a decent start at showing why a lot of the things that you care about as a liberal could be achieved via localism, and might even be better achieved via localism than the current system we have. Up next, we'll be doing the conservative case for localism. And by up next, I really mean right now. I'm intentionally releasing the liberal case and conservative case episodes together as a pair, which was a ton of work. I'm not sure I'll do that again, and that's why I've been gone for so long. Sorry about that. The reason I wanted to release them together is because I think it shows that localism has a lot to offer you, no matter what your politics are, and that the freedom a localist America provides lets everyday citizens exercise their political agency in ways that could create vastly different communities. The key is that it's people getting to decide for themselves. And since people across America have a diversity of political beliefs, values, and preferences, a system that allows true expression of choice will naturally result in communities with equally diverse laws, liberal or otherwise. The key is that everyone is making their own decisions in ways that don't affect or limit people outside of your community. You stay out of my backyard, and I'll stay out of yours. One last thing before I go. I really encourage you to listen to the conservative case for localism, even if you're a solid lefty. It's partially because I worked hard on it, and I want the viewer numbers, but it's also so that you can see some of the consequences of localism that you might be a bit more uncomfortable with. I kind of have this tendency to give localism a utopian bent and claim it can basically solve all your problems. I don't want this to be a snake oil situation. Please consider listening to how conservatives would benefit from localism and how they would leverage local self-rule to create a society that you might heavily oppose. Now, my pitch is that as long as you can decide how things are run where you live, why is it your problem that people might be doing something you disagree with 1,000 miles away? But I know that people may feel differently, and those people would benefit from the full context that the conservative case for localism would provide. If that sounds interesting, please do check us out on Spotify and YouTube, and feel free to send me a question or comment at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist with a T, pod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.